Now broadcasting the Dr. Nilda Business Foresight Show, positioning your business with strategies for an extraordinary future. Dr. Nilda features expert guests from diverse backgrounds to bring you their stories and strategies that have helped them reach their success. The diversity in industries gives you that panoramic view from an array of industries. They are innovators, thought leaders, trendsetters, and strategists. Here, Dr. Nilda reveals strategies that will position you to be on the cutting edge and be able to do what you love with the people you like, making the profits you want to live the lifestyle that you have dreamed of. And now, here's your host, Dr. Nilda Perez.
Hello, and welcome back to the Dr. Nilda Business Foresight Show. And with me today is my co-host, Rachel Calderon. Say hello, Rachel.
Hello, everyone.
And a very special guest from the fashion industry who's also a foresight strategist. And I have to tell you, I'm going to read you her bio. She's an amazing lady. So her name is Dr. Natlie Nixon. She's the CEO of Figure 8 Thinking LLC, a company that helps organizations accelerate innovation and growth by developing meaningful strategy through design thinking and ethnographic research. She's a design strategist and a hybrid thinker with a background in anthropology and fashion. She is a design strategist, a hybrid thinker, and a background anthropologist and fashion. She's an editor of the Strategic Design Thinking, Innovation Products, Services, Experiences, and Beyond, a regular contributor to Inc. online magazine. Natalie is a fellow in the Paris d.School. She is a lecturer at the University of Pennsylvania. She has earned the BA Cum Laude, which is awesome, in Anthropology and African Studies from Vassar College, and she has her PhD in Design Management from the University of Westminster in London. Welcome, Dr. Natalie. How are you?
Welcome, Natalie.
Hi, thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me.
So I just want to jump into this because I'm quite fascinated by the fact that your background is in anthropology and it's also in fashion, and you're a foresight strategist. How did you get involved in foresight? Explain that.
Well, I really believe maybe I could even take it back to my roots in anthropology, because anthropology, unlike other social sciences like sociology and political science and economics, which I always say give us the bird's eye view of society, anthropology trains you to see from the perspective of the worm's eye view, to be on the ground and to understand units of society and culture that are a bit smaller. So you begin to observe, you get trained in observation, and you begin to look for different signals. And then later, when I worked in the fashion industry, we use a lot of trend research in the fashion business in order to better anticipate customers' needs. So I would say that my introduction really began with a shift in my mindset that was informed by being educated in anthropology, becoming an ethnographer, using ethnography in my work, and my industry experience in fashion.
Okay, that's interesting. And how did you, now I just want to jump in and I want to ask, how did you match foresight and fashion together?
Foresight as a term really came a bit later. When I was an academic for 16 years. I was a professor for 16 years. And one of my last contributions was to start something called the Strategic Design MBA program. And part of that curriculum, we offered a course in foresight strategy. I was already doing scenario planning in the way that I was teaching strategy and business model innovation. And then actually pretty recently, I did the formal work of getting certified by the Institute for the Future as a foresight strategist. So it was a really nice way to bring together and converge all of these other skills I have been gathering in my toolkit, so to speak.
Okay, fabulous. Awesome. So I want you to explain to the audience, what is an ethnographic researcher?
Ethnography is the methodology that anthropologists are trained in to use certain, I would say, kind of three basic tools that are brought to the fore. The primary one is observation, which is a lot harder than it may initially sound, because there's a big difference between observing and then interpreting what you observe. It also you spend a lot of time in the front really trying to identify what the questions are that you could be curious about, that you could be investigating. You try to go in with a very open mind. There's this whole principle in anthropology called cultural relativism. So you're very, there's a lot of there's a lot of terminology, but reflexivity and being very self-aware of yourself in the process of observing what's called the other, people who are different from you. And that could be in a corporation, that could be a group of people in a very different country from where you live and work, etc. Interviewing is another tool that's used in ethnography. Interviewing is a bit more proactive. It's a method of inquiry where you're asking questions to help you understand a phenomena. It could be a ritual, it could be an interaction, it could be an artifact from the perspective of the people whom you're trying to understand and learn about. And you have to also be very aware of the types of questions that you frame and form. And then there's also something called contextual inquiry, right, where within context, you are asking people how they are making a certain type of meal, or administering a drug, or doing a process. So it's within the context of the person. You're also asking kind of clarifying questions. And from a traditional anthropologist perspective, ethnographies can last years. And it's interesting now that ethnography is being much more welcomed in corporate environments. I think there's a bit of a split in the field of anthropology. There are definitely those anthropologists who aren't as happy about anthropology being used in a corporate environment. I think they believe there could be some compromises that happen, right, in that context. But I think that having anthropologists being hired by corporations to help them have a different lens and understanding of the way they go about doing their work and designing their organizations is pretty important and helpful. So ethnography is a methodology that tries to understand from as objective a perspective as possible how phenomena is working. I don't really believe in objectivity. I think it's very hard to completely remove your own bias, right, and your own opinion from something, but anthropologists try.
Okay, I love it. Awesome. I love it. Why do you think that foresight matters? Foresight
is a tool for strategy, in my view, and it's important to try to lay out multiple possible futures. I always remind people that foresight work isn't about looking into a crystal ball or right, trying to identify one singular future, but it's more to help people be prepared and to anticipate multiple futures. And what I think is cool about foresight work is that it forces you to be hyper-focused on the present state, actually, because you have to become much more observant and aware of phenomena that you might just have kind of like an intuitive response. You can't always explain it, but it's a bit of a variation in the way things have been happening.
Exactly. And this is why I think of the ethnographic background, that research is a beautiful marriage with foresight, because mm-hmm, foresight has that look at the past, it looks at the present, looks at the future. And so with ethnography, I think bringing it all together it's a beautiful marriage. I mean, it's mm-hmm, absolutely, it's perfect, because you get that almost well-rounded, which is very necessary for foresight work.
Yes,
necessary. So this is I think this is fascinating. I love it. Love it.
Thank you.
So when you go into a company, you do the ethnography research and you also do the foresight research. So you're looking at trends, but again, you look at it from a very well-rounded, almost a 360 perspective.
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. So how is your background in fashion? Because fashion, again, you look at anthropology and foresight, and that sort of makes sense. Now we're talking about fashion. How does your background in fashion inform you in your work as a foresight practitioner? Like, how did that come in? How does that help, if it does help?
One of the fashion definitely plays a very useful part in my work, in the way I approach things. A lot of people underestimate the power and legitimacy and robustness of fashion. So people who don't understand it as a business and as a system think it's kind of a frilly foo-foo venture or area of design. And there is a hierarchy in design where kind of architecture is at the top of the hierarchy, and then other forms of design like product design, industrial design, graphic design, UX design, etc., come after. And then there's fashion, and even in the way the academic literature refers to it, they'll refer to it as architecture and design, or design and fashion. So it's definitely an underestimated field. What I have found so valuable about my experience in fashion, and I was an entrepreneurial hat designer. My mom taught me and my sister how to sew when we were girls. Women in my family are very gifted in the fiber arts. My mother my grandmother, my great aunts were very gifted seamstresses, and my mother was a weaver. So I really grew up in that type of environment. For me, it was functional art. And I later in my early 20s went back to it because for very practical reasons, I needed a wardrobe. I was living in New York City and I couldn't afford all the pretty frocks in Manhattan. So I started Nat's Hats really out of need, ironically. Later, I worked in a more corporate fashion environment. I worked for a division of the limited brands, and I worked in the area of global fashion sourcing. And sourcing is the logistical arm of the fashion business, and it is the engine of the business, and it is the hub. So you are working constantly with the design teams, the buyers, the mills, the factories, the logistics, freight forwarding companies. And I had the opportunity to live and work in Sri Lanka, in Southeast Asia, and in Portugal when I worked on the Victoria's Secret account. But what all that experience taught me—
That's awesome.
Thanks. What all that experience taught me is that fashion really gives you, first of all, fashion requires you to have a point of view, because it's not about, well, let me start. I was about to say it's not about being copycat, although knockoff culture is prevalent in fashion. There is a whole group of people who believe, and I agree with them, that the knockoff culture actually compels you to be more innovative, because you know as soon as you launch something, you could be knocked off. Mm-hmm. But fashion really requires you to have a point of view. It really requires you to pay attention. And I love the way fashion is a wonderful blend of an aesthetic know-how and a sensitivity to the arts, and as well as having some business savvy and having some practical element as well. So for all those reasons, I have found my background in fashion to be really helpful and gives a lot of added value to the work that I do.
I love it.
And I find also that the one thing with fashion is that it's very focused on trends. But not only is it focused on trends, when a fashion or a style comes out, that's really outdated, because you guys are 5, 10, 15 years ahead of that season. So that's what I found. I wrote an article the other day about that when you look at fashion, they really were the first foresight strategists in a way, because for them and the car industry, those are two industries that are prevalent in understanding understanding trends and understanding the importance of trends, and understanding that, you know, if you know what's going to happen in a year, you're too late. It's already too late.
Yes,
that far ahead. Would you agree?
I do, and the product life cycle in fashion is much shorter than in the automotive industry. In some ways, I don't know which is harder, the work of trend teams in auto or in fashion, and even since the time when I worked for Mast Industries, the division of limited brands, the life cycle of a product has shrunk even further, so that it might have been 6 months out that you would be preparing. And now, because of fast fashion, you're preparing, it's a month out, 3 weeks out from concept to the product being on the shelf. In auto, on the other hand, you have, because the componentry of making an automobile is a bit more, the materiality, the engineering that's involved is a bit more involved.
Right.
You're talking about maybe a 2-year life cycle, maybe a year, but probably 2-3 years. So when you're talking about color and fabrication, yes, you really have to be really seeing far around the corner. The other cool thing that fashion is interesting about fashion has to pay attention to trend, and it simultaneously sets trends. Right. Which is very interesting, especially those fashion designers that are more on the margins. They're kind of the emerging designers. They have this wonderful ability and gift to be able to set trends, because they're seeing things from a totally different perspective than the more mainstream fashion designers might be. That's why the mainstream fashion designers really want to have on their team really quirky, weird, divergent thinkers to help them stay ahead.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I love it. Okay.
Like that. So
go ahead.
Okay. So as a design thinker, what is design thinking, and what do you as a design strategist do?
So as a design strategist, I'm working at the intersection of creativity and strategy, and I use design thinking to help me do that. And I would say design thinking is about 50% ethnography and 50% the application of design principles. Right. So in design thinking, you're using a human-centered problem framing and problem-solving process to identify the needs of people. And you start with empathy. You ask a lot of questions. We probably spent 80% of our time obsessed with it. We even ask the right question before we go running down a rabbit hole of assumptions. And so the 50% ethnography part is the ability to frame the problem through a method of inquiry that uses observation and interviewing and et cetera. The design principles are when you're trying to really visualize a concept, which could be as low fidelity as a doodle, which everybody can do, to really high fidelity visualizations like a 3D digital printed version of something. But it's being really comfortable with visualizing a concept, because you want to have something more tangible that people, to which people can respond and give you feedback. So one of the distinctions between a design strategy approach and what maybe a more traditional management consultancy approach might do is that there's a real emphasis on building to learn and getting feedback on a new service, a new experience, a new process in iterative stages. So while traditional design is about designing tangible objects like clothing, buildings, products, in design thinking, we're designing the intangible. We're designing services and experiences and processes, and we're using a need-finding process that involves ethnography, and then we validate our ideas through a lot of design principles like visualization and prototyping.
Okay, fantastic. So when you go into a company, where do you start? Where do you start with them?
I like to start with questions. I ask a lot of questions, and I always ask and build into the process, making sure they're on the same page and are comfortable with this, that I have an initial time to just do some need finding, and because I want to understand, as we do in foresight work, I want to understand the present state. Because if I don't understand the present state, how can we possibly start talking about where you want to go. You have to have a real clear understanding of that presidency. And a lot of my clients find it very helpful to have someone like me come in, because I bring what's called fresh eyes, a child's gaze. I ask the naive, stupid questions that when you've been in the business for years, certain assumptions start getting built in, which can be dangerous. So it's good to have someone come in and help you to, and ask, why do you do it that way? And what if you did it another way? Let's try it. And so the first stage is a level setting, and it's doing what I call a mini ethnography, emphasis on mini. It's a very short kind of ethnography. And then it's a process of co-creating with the client, because I don't like to do I don't know how to do cookie cutter solutions. So it's much more about us co-creating a process. Now, to be honest, a lot of clients, when they hear this, they think, oh, wow, that's great. Let's do that. This is what our team needs, what our company needs. But when they actually go through the process, it's very uncomfortable, because when you've been used to having a consultant come in and say, okay, based on what I've seen, this is what you should do. My next step is, okay, let's start. First of all, let's have you, I like to teach you to fish. So let's have you start to also practice these methods. You practice having fresh eyes. What are you starting to see? And then let's start to build some prototypes of a new type of meeting process, or a new way to engage clients on their business, or a new way to develop a marketing strategy. And the reason why there's some resistance sometimes at the beginning is because it's time intensive. You're learning something new, and when we learn new things, we're not necessarily good at it right away. It's also a very ambiguous process. So at the very beginning stages, it's not always clear where all of this is leading. So my students have heard me say this a lot. My clients hear me say this, which is to suspend judgment, to trust the process. Things really will start to emerge that will be indicators of the direction to go. So the process I use is much more erring on the side of co-creating with the group, with the company, with the client, because ultimately we tend to own those things which we've had a hand in creating. Those things are where we have been part of the evidence.
Yes, you get their buy-in.
Exactly.
Right. So with that said, my next question is, so have you ever had the experience that when you go into a company and you're talking to them about, solving their problems, that what they think is the problem is not always the problem?
Absolutely. Yeah. That's why I said we're obsessed with framing the problem. So, that they might have thought initially that we need to, the focus of our work needs to be on breaking down silos, which is in some ways a bit of it's a common need, and it also can be a bit abstract. They may realize that the real focus, if we do some kind of journey mapping of a typical day in the life or a year in the life, the challenge starts on the onboarding process. So maybe the real focus has to be on how we even do our recruiting, hiring, and onboarding, because that's going to set the entire tone for how people ultimately work together. Just as an example, another colleague of mine gave an example of this was about queuing in line for a major vendor at a stadium. And they said, our problem is something's wrong with our cash registers. We need a better cash register system. We need to invest in better software technology for our cash registers. Well, through the observation process, they realized maybe they could, bump up the technology in the cash register, but it was actually also a big bottleneck that was happening, and just the design of the line queue. And that only was revealed through observation. So you're absolutely right. oftentimes what we initially think is the question or problem we should be looking at is different, but we don't know that until we start to investigate.
Exactly.
Wow.
Okay, awesome. So what's the intersection between design thinking and foresight work?
I think the intersection is really they are both methods of inquiry that values, as I was just kind of mapping out, we need to do some present state level setting. We need to understand context or do some backcasting. And in order to understand how to move forward. And the opportunity that forecast gives to companies in terms of giving them some flexibility and optimism about understanding what multiple scenarios could be and how to be more responsive instead of reactionary is also an optimism that comes from the design thinking process, largely in part because people have a hand in designing and identifying those opportunities.
Okay. So do you want to give a takeaway? Give 2 takeaways for the audience today.
Takeaways about design.
About design and foresight.
One takeaway is that it's all in the questions we ask, right? So the yield of information and insight we get is only going to be as good as the questions we ask. So how can we get better at questions? We have to become better observers and better listeners. A bullet point under that takeaway is I would really, really recommend a wonderful book I'm almost finished reading called A More Beautiful Question by Warren Berger. I really love this book, and I like it because of he actually credits a lot of design thinking in his work, but he basically talks about 3 basic questions that intelligent people and companies pose to problem solve, which is why,
right?
Then what if, and then how. And then the second takeaway I would give is just to my favorite adage, which is to suspend judgment.
Love it. I love it. Thank you so much, Dr. Natalie. This was
Thank
awesome.
Awesome.
You are a wealth of knowledge. I love your background. I think your background is so fascinating because I feel that it has really solidified where you are today and how you can help people from so many different perspectives, from the design to the graphic research to there's so much that you bring to the table. This is amazing. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
This was wonderful. So, again, this is another foresight specialist that we have, another foresight researcher. And we want to thank you guys for being here with us once again. We look forward to seeing you next week with another futurist. Until then, we will see you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Foresight Strategy Show. You can hear host Dr. Nilda, co-host Rachel with featured guests every Saturday morning at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on Facebook Live or anytime on demand. Visit www.drnildaperez.com/show. For more information, sign up to our Foresight Strategies Insider newsletter, a $10 value for free at www.drnildaperez.com/newsletter.